Okay, well, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us. This is LookUpStrata's presentation on Queensland fire matters. My name is Will Marquand from Tower Body Corporate, and I'm standing in today for Nikki Jovovich from LookUpStrata, who's your regular host. She's on a well-earned vacation, and I've been roped in to assist with today's seminar. Today we're going to be talking to Stefan Bauer from Fire Matters. He's an all-round fire expert, and importantly, he's a fire auditor, which means that his job is to check that all the fire systems in a building are working correctly. Hello, Stefan.
Yeah, good morning, everyone.
Okay. Before we begin, I'd like to mention that the information contained in this session, including the discussions that arise from submitted questions, is not legal advice and should not be relied upon as legal advice. You should always seek independent advice before acting on any information contained in this session. Okay, so Stefan is a fire compliance specialist and founder of Fire Matters after serving as a territory manager, service manager, and systems certifier in 3 distinct fire compliance firms. With the aid of his years of experience in fire system compliance, Mr. Bauer and his team of experts have designed, written, and developed a cloud-based system that's used for managing legislated custom fire safety equipment. Servicing and service providers, as well as preventative maintenance recording. Ooh, that's quite a lot, Stefan. Stefan regularly responds to questions about fire safety on LookUpStrata, particularly for our Queensland audience, although he has knowledge of fire matters across the nation. And we'd really like to thank him for joining us today. The format, he's going to give us a little presentation, and then we'll see where we get from there. All right, thanks, Stefan. I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, like Will said, I've been in the industry for 20 years, worked for many service providers, and 15 years ago I started my own company when I realized that the service provider is managing fire compliance based on their budget and not on just strictly compliance. So today we want to go over the licensing changes in Queensland that have literally come into effect on 1st of November last year, and just need to set up my presentation. Well, can you tell me whether you see the right screen?
Yep, that's coming through. Thanks very much.
Good. I just need to figure out my presenter's notes while I'm here. Here we go. So yes, so we, just bear in mind that this is purely Queensland licensing requirements. The other states are still in the process of catching up. So we've had fire licensing since 2011. So again, for me, I'm a certifier in fire detection system, emergency lighting, passive fire protection, portable fire protection, and also a fire safety advisor. I used to run courses for 9 years at the Services Trade College here in Queensland for fire licensing. So basically anyone that was up for a QBCC license had to go through the Services Trade College to get their knowledge tested, and I've been the assessor there for like 9 years. This is what we want to cover, is the evolution of fire safety, the fire safety Queensland legislation in regards to licensing, then the separate streams that have come out of the license review, the types of license, the classes, any consequences of unlicensed work, and then how do we check that a company or an individual is QBCC licensed. So at the inceptions of our licensing was triggered by the Childers Backpackers fire. The cause of the fire was arson, and when the regulator looked at the aftermath, what they found is that various escape routes were compromised, the fire detection system were not working, there was no emergency exit lighting, there was no service records or staff training available. So the key changes out of that review was mandatory licensing requirements for Queensland and the Budget Accommodation Act for Queensland, which meant that a lot of hostels had to upgrade their fire management procedure and their fire management protection equipment. So in Queensland, we had, prior to 2011, we've had our Queensland Fire Protection Industry Board, which basically offered voluntary acknowledgement of your technical and Australian standard expertise. And So technicians and certifiers, they took a voluntary test and then got awarded upon successful completion and peer review, got awarded a fire protection license from the Fire Protection Board of Queensland. So that went on for many, many years, and then the BCA, or now QBCC, from 2011 made licensing mandatory. So the QBCC has taken over the entire licensing management. So where does the licensing requirements do fit in? Well, to understand that, we need to talk about prescribed documentation. So prescribed documentation is documentation that are called up in legislation. So which means everyone knows that these documents must exist, and everyone knows what must be on these documents and who can sign them. So it starts off with the design of a building and the design of a fire system and installation required for the building. And it ends up with a certification of the design compliance with a Form 15. After the installation, taken into account all your Australian standards and performance requirements, a Form 12 is issued. So all of these forms are license requirement forms. Sorry about that. Once the certification of the installation has been confirmed with a Form 12, the maintenance takes over. And there we have our maintenance records, surveys, annual condition reports, and eventually the occupier statement. Evacuation planning has also got prescribed documentations that relate to regular housekeeping, making sure exit doors are not blocked, etc. Record of the review of the emergency plan and the evacuation training, as well as the evacuation practice. So in regards of licensing, who's got the responsibility to look out that the person that is conducting the maintenance is appropriately licensed? Well, in Queensland, we've got the Building Fire Safety Regulations, and the section 54 puts the responsibility on the occupier of the building. In this case, the occupier or managing entity, such as a body corporate, they are required to ensure that their contractor and their service technicians hold the appropriately licensed. So it's very clear in the Building Fire Safety Regs that where the responsibility lies. So this is basically to confirm that you engage a company or an individual that has got the licenses to complete all your paperwork throughout the annual life cycle. So the overview. This has come in effect with a bit of a delay on the 1st of November 2011, and it has, for some companies, quite a bit of an impact on how they do business and what they needed to do to comply with the new licenses. So we have out of this review came the 5 license streams. So we've got a passive, obviously, like you can see, water-based, special hazards, portable, and electrical. They are split into different classes of licenses, and then we have different license types, which we will cover over the next few slides. So starting off with the portable stream and installation, hose reels and fire hydrants. The license classes are the install and maintain class and a certify class. The key changes to this, which is probably the license class that's been the most affected, is that practitioners without a plumber's license can only maintain and install unpumped fire hydrant systems, which means there's no supportive pump on site. They've been fed straight off the town's mains. On an unpumped hydrant systems, they can only do the presence of water. The annual test has to be done by a licensed plumber or sprinkler fitter. So the service contractor may no longer be capable of doing that type of work under their license class unless they have either employed new people or upskilled themselves by becoming a licensed plumber or sprinkler fitter. So the annual test, which is the annual hydrant flow test, must be done by a licensed plumber or by a licensed sprinkler fitter. As I said, the most significant change In our auditing that we conducted over the past 12 months, we've come across quite a few companies that ignored their scope of license in their license change and still continue to perform that type of work for the end user. So you need to make sure that your fire contractor, and especially in regards to a hydrant system, has got the appropriately licensed, and also the individual that is coming out to service your equipment. The next stream is the passive stream. So this is covered by fire doors, fire shutters, any service penetration, firewalls and fire dampers and air conditioning systems. The license classes are Certify and Inspect and Test. So we have two new Certify classes, two new install and maintain classes for smoke walls and fire rated ceilings, and for fire collars and joint ceilings. Further, every other license classes have been turned over, so the old license classes still exist. So the only key changes are the two new license classes, but whoever held the license prior to the 1st of November 21 can still operate in this field. So there's no major shift except for builders. Builders need to upskill by May 25 to include the Certify in their scope of service. As I said, existing license classes are continued to be held. So the electrical stream comprises of fire detection and warning system and the emergency lighting system. We've got a new design class in fire detection and warning system, and the remaining license stay the same. Install and maintain for fire detection includes the inspect and test. So and we have a new inspection test license for emergency lighting and Certify as well. So the key changes are that electricians now require a QBCC license. They were previously exempt to install and maintain fire alarm detection systems or emergency lighting systems. It was deemed that under their electrical license, they were able to do that. However, most electricians have very little knowledge of fire systems or fire emergency lighting systems, so they do have to upskill their current license requirements. Battery-operated smoke alarms are no longer classed as fire protection work. This relates to Class 2 buildings and only the smoke alarms. In some licensees that had previously had a Certify license class, they do require to upskill the install and maintain level by May 2025. So it's still a fair way to go for those people. But that is something that needs to be, monitored in a couple of years' time. Electrician now also must upskill to test and inspect and or certify emergency lighting. I think I've mentioned that before. So the next stream is the water-based stream, which basically encompasses a sprinkler system, hydrant system, fire pumps, and hose reels. There's no significant changes in this license class. There's no upskilling required. Those personnel that maintaining this type of equipment, they all come out of trade qualifications, i.e. sprinkler fitter or plumbers. So they cover these license classes in respect to the maintenance and installation. Then we have special hazard systems. They mainly used in switchboard rooms, aircraft hangars, and they are there for asset protection. We've got various systems with gaseous, foam system, and chemical systems. License classes are install and maintain and certify. And basically the upskill requirements here are key changes that needs to be upskilled by May next year and May 25. So not very common on body corporate buildings, but mainly on asset protection buildings. So for the first time, whilst the courses have been available for some time, but for the first time they've now been caught up in legislation, which is a design license. So we have the design license for the electrical stream and for the water-based stream, and they are applicable prior to a building is being built. So somebody assesses, I want to build a certain type of building, the design for the water-based or electrical system has to be carried out beforehand, and then once the design is compliant, a Form 15 will be issued for the design of the fire protection system. The install and maintain license is basically put on equipment ready to use or restore to the original operation or alter it from its original design. This is the license that is required to be able to do that. The documentation that is affected by that are any records of repairs or any records of maintenance, any records of any inspection and testing, and an issue of a statement of installation compliance, which is your Form 12. So all of these documentations require the license details of the fire practitioner to be recorded, and they need to be within the scope of the license class that are applicable. So inspect and test means repair or replace. And they, again, the people with that kind of license, they can prepare a record of maintenance, i.e. in a form of a logbook for fire protection equipment like fire panel, fire pumps, etc. that require logbooks, or summary records where required for extinguishers and portable hydrant points, etc. Again, these documentations must have the license details of not only the service provider, but the individual conducting the maintenance. With this review, we have a new definition of certify. It incorporates any certificate. So in order to give you a certify or give you a certificate of compliance, you need to have a certifier license. Also, the annual survey that is required under AS 1851 has to be carried out by a person who's got a certifier license. Okay. The certificate here will be the certificate 12, which means that the installation of the fire protection equipment does comply with the National Construction Code and any relevant Australian standard. So where does this come in? As I said, Form 12, certify and install compliance at the time of build or any alterations to the system. And then certify the annual maintenance, which AS 1851 requires an annual survey to be conducted by a competent person who holds a certifier license, who can basically look at the site and say, yes, there's been no changes that would affect the operation of the fire protection equipment, and here's my license details that said that everything is still compliant, at the end of the year. The annual condition report is part of the AS 1851 documentation requirements in section 1. That is also, which is basically a statement that all the work has been conducted in regards to the relevant standards, and that the system actually works. So again, that has to be certified or signed by a person who's got a certifier license within the company. And then completing the occupier statement. As it says, occupier statement can be done by an occupier without any qualifications. However, you will need to be sure that you understand exactly the requirements. If it's done commercially, you should have a certifier license to complete the occupier statement. Because what you're saying on the occupier statement is that the previous 12 months, everything has been conducted in relation to fire compliance, and you've got all the records to prove that. Okay. So The changes to the certifier license is that the inspection and test part has been removed from the relevant scope. So they are now only going to be a certifier, no longer an install and maintain person, which kind of makes sense because if you install and maintain and there's a mishap, you're most likely to certify it, even if it's not 100% compliant. Whilst if you have a third party looking at it, you have a better rigor of compliance and performance. So therefore, some contractors or technicians may need to upskill to ensure that they have the inspect and test licenses or install and maintain licenses if they need to maintain it. So here again, important is that your certifier and the technicians are appropriately licensed when signing these documentations. Otherwise, as we said earlier, it's the occupier that is in breach of the legislation. So now we're coming to fire licenses types. So we got various types. We've got like a contractor's, a company license. So a contractor employs nominee supervisors who are their certifiers, and they employ service technicians who are their install and maintain and inspect and test people. Okay. This can be an individual as well. However, if they do not hold a certified license, as the building owner or occupier, you must be aware of it because they are not able to sign the relevant documentation that is required. They may do so, but you must make sure that you call them up if they don't have the correct licenses. These individuals are usually contracted to the fire contracting company and work under their license. Again, nominee supervisors, they usually hold a certifier license. They make sure they've got a higher degree of knowledge of the Australian standard and the National Construction Code than the person that does the routine maintenance. Okay. And then we have the occupational license, which is basically an employee that does maintain your fire equipment on site. So who needs what license? So a fire company that holds a fire detection license, a portable license, and a sprinkler system license, they must have a nominee for fire detection. They must have a nominee for portable fire equipment, and they must have a nominee for sprinkler systems. This could be the same person if it holds the same license, if a person holds multiple licenses, but in bigger companies, they are usually 3 different types of individuals. So the employees, then they need the employees with the correct occupational license, i.e. they need people that have the fire alarm detection, portable or sprinkler license that can do the maintenance on it. And if they have subcontractors, they must also be appropriate licensed. So the implication of unlicensed fireworks. Well, first of all, the equipment may not be correctly maintained, and it therefore may not operate as per the original intent. Service records are usually incomplete or not existent. Equipment cannot correctly be serviced. So equipment failure on demand, say a pump is required to run when an alarm, a fire alarm goes off. Pump's not regularly maintained or not correctly maintained by a person that knows and understands it, it may fail. Right? It also may shorten the life cycle of any fire equipment that is installed on site. Another issue to consider is the safety of occupants could be compromised, which in terms is a breach of legislations, which has consequences of fines and possible imprisonment for really serious offences, obviously. But what we probably most likely will see is that your insurance is being voided if you contract unlicensed contractors for your fire protection work. So how do we check a license, I hear you asking, right? So the QBCC's got various registers that they have available online, where you can check a license number from an individual. But you want to make sure that if you check the license number for an individual, that you also check the company, or if you check the license number for a company, you also check the license number for the individuals that hold the certifier licenses. Okay. So other things to consider is once you do your license search is, first of all, is the license active? There's various fees why a license might be inactive. The fees are not paid, the license being suspended for further investigations, or there is no proof of upskilling that is required. You want to also check if there's any disciplinary records against an individual or the company itself. Any orders that might be outstanding or in the process, you want to be aware of before you're dealing with that company. So now you check the license class and license grade for a company or the service technician. Another thing that needs to be looked at is any conditions that are on the license. So licenses can have certain conditions set up on by the QBCC that may prevent the practitioner or company from undertaking certain tasks that are not within their license scope. So in this aspect here, this license is only applicable for or restricted to install and maintain, which means this particular company or individual cannot certify any installation, any maintenance, or sign any annual surveys or annual condition reports, which are critical for demonstrating compliance with the legislation. So the introduction with the new licensing scheme basically has given plumbers a free license to work on hydrant systems. So there is a different register for plumbers and individuals. Yes, so there's you need to make sure that the plumber has got the correct endorsements on their licenses, which you can check on their plumber and drainer register. So this is basically the overview of the licensing. Critically important is it's the occupiers / body corporates or managing entity responsibility to make sure that all licensing checks have been made and also have been made regularly, because licensing scope can change, and so each time you engage a new contractor, ensure that you've got that they've got the correct licenses and send you the correct people that have the licenses. Okay. This is the end of our QBCC licensing check. Just on the regards to what we offer as a fire company, we are purely doing audits. We're not a maintenance provider. We're purely doing audits on fire protection compliance for many companies and organizations around Queensland. Our main ones are the Queensland Government or Department of Housing, Australia Post, Queensland-wide, and many body corporates locally. So we offer basically an annual site inspection. We combine that with the annual emergency training and conduct a site audit, and then give you either an outstanding list of items that need to be chased up or a certificate of compliance. Well, thank you very much for your time this morning.
Wonderful, thanks for that, Stefan. It's always really interesting to see the inside of compliance matters. They're very technical, aren't they? And I think a lot of people find them quite impenetrable as a result. And it's sort of that level of impenetrability often causes a lot of frustration, I know, amongst body corporate customers out there. So let's see if we can work through some of those issues that may be causing some troubles for owners. You were saying that the legislation has, changed. Do you think the changes are good, and are they having a positive effect so far?
Overall, the licensing review was well overdue, as when it happened in 2011, it was kind of an ad hoc system, and we had, like, from memory, like 57 different license classes. We have reduced that quite a bit to less than 30. In regards to revoking a license from individuals or companies that have been undertaking work, especially in regards to hydrant flow testing, for many, many years under their license scope, and all of a sudden not being licensed anymore for that type of work, we're taking a lot of expertise out of the market. So I don't think that has been very well managed, but also we've given, plumbers a license that to be able to do that work, who may have absolutely no history in hydrant testing. So it's a that part of the licensing review could have been done a little bit better to ensure that we keep the expertise in the industry.
Okay. How does Queensland compare to the other states around Australia? Do you think we're in a good position, or have we got work to do? Is there anything we could borrow from someone else?
Oh, there's always good ideas we can borrow, that's for sure. However, Queensland has always been, the last few years, ahead of the curve. We've had our licensing system for many years now, while other states don't. Other states still rely very much on self-certification, and we can see in New South Wales where that got them to. They're in a massive review at the moment, and they, while it's a little different, they're following in the same footpath as Queensland has done with in regards to licensing.
Okay, and some people out there might be sort of saying, more legislation, more licensing just means more costs for body corporates and more costs for themselves as owners. What would you say to someone who's kind of who's taking that approach to it?
I'm just cost conscious, but like we all are, of course, right? What we've got to figure out here, or what we've got to bear in mind, is that this applies to life safety equipment, right? This applies to either, people themselves to be alerted, or being able to evacuate a building or come out of a burning building, or it comes down to building an asset protection, and also, the equipment that firefighters need to interact with. So yes, I do understand that there's always a big cost implication, and 90% of the time we don't use any of the fire equipment that's even installed in a building, right? Yeah. So, but if you do have a fire, you want it there, you want it working, and you want it well maintained. So yeah, it's not a luxury item that we can do without. If you're on level 35 in a multi-story building and there is a fire in the building, you want to know that the fire alarm system, that all associated and interconnected systems have been tested, are working. And, in the past, it could have been as easy as just ticking a few boxes and going like, yeah, it'll be all right. These days, you've got to put your license number under it and say, I've tested this. And it's not the company that is responsible, it's the individual itself that makes, signs a statement saying, it is all in working order, and I'm happy to leave it as. So yes, I do understand the cost implications, but the bigger the building, the higher the cost. The smaller the building, the smaller the cost.
Yeah, sure. And as we see the licensing change, are we seeing a sort of corresponding change in the companies? Are they behaving more responsibly? Is that not that they weren't behaving irresponsibly before necessarily, but are you seeing sort of an improvement in the way that they approach the work from your?
So yes, there's always two types of companies: the ones that go strictly by the interpretation of the legislation and make sure everything is correct, and then there is the ones that interpret the legislations rather loosely, and they usually find the opposite in their customers, that they're just looking for the cheapest price, not necessarily the best product. And what I always say, if nothing ever happens, nothing will ever happen. But in Queensland, our legislation is retrospective. So if you have a fire in a building, you need to be able to produce the prescribed documents under the legislation for the period of the last 2 years. If you can't do that, well, or you've missed diligence on the way, the insurances certainly will have a word to say. But if somebody gets hurt or killed, then the regulator will come on top of it as well.
Yeah, right. So that's quite significant that the legislation is retrospective, because you can get away with kind of being in breach for an awful long time, but if the worst happens, you might suddenly find yourself in a much worse situation than you had been if you had been compliant. Is that?
And it's more expensive.
Right. So it's quite tricky. So I mean, if you said some of the contractors out there are a little bit looser in their applications, what would be a warning sign perhaps that someone, how do we have that level of trust? You can say, well, we can check with the QBCC, but people can still be licensed, but they can still be loose. So what would you say we should really be looking out for as customers?
Basically, what my advice would be there is the documentation compliance. So legislation very clearly says what documents you need and what needs to be included in those documents. And if the service provider doesn't provide you that in the first place, I would have my first questions saying, how am I covering this? Because a lot of service providers, they just write in the logbook, yeah, all good, was here, monthly test, all good, and then they walk away. So those are the types of dockets or service records that we always question and delve in deeper. And if a service provider provides you a compliant logbook or a compliant record of maintenance, then you have a much better feeling than if you just sort of trying to gather all the information together for the past 12 months and trying to find it. So sure. Documentation compliance is one of the biggest things. But also it comes down to, before you initially engage your service provider, do your proper checks. What licenses and what type of work they can offer, and whether that is what you need.
Okay. I'm a body corporate manager. A lot of the complaint we get from customers is sort of, we engage a fire company and then every month they come to the building, or every 3 months or however often it is. And every time they kind of find a fault. There's always something new to do and always something new to pay for. And it's quite difficult for the body corporates to say, well, do we really need this? I'm often asking the question, is this a requirement or a recommendation? Perhaps you could comment on that a little bit, because I think a lot of people feel that they're being kind of like unnecessarily required to do work that they're not always confident that they need to do.
And I totally understand. That's exactly the space where we're living, and I see those sort of things on a daily basis. The considerations, well, that are given is that, first of all, service providers, they're a business, right? They need to find equipment, and there's they need to find work to keep their people busy and pay their bills. There's two things that come to mind from my time as working in the service side of things. Is a lot of people, in particular in the body corporate environment, they always choose the cheapest contractor.
Yeah.
Right. They get 3 quotes. 90% of the time, it's the cheapest one that gets the price. But he's cheap for a reason, right? So if you give the contractor the correct money that he needs to maintain your equipment, then that's what he will do. Every contractor, if he needs to come to site, he's got to send a person that he's paying, he's got to send a car, he's got to have infrastructure behind him. The cost to all of them is exactly the same, right? Very, very little. Some might be a little bit smarter than others, but the cost is very much the same. So if you find a contractor, and I've had these situations, you work out the amount of time that's needed to maintain that equipment. Well, some of the quotes that I've seen, the contractor would run out of money after 6 months. Okay, so where's he going to subsidize the other 6 months of servicing from repairs? Right? Another item to think about is not always, and this is another issue, is that the correct information is available for the contractor on site. So when they send out a technician, he may apply the wrong standard of installation or maintenance and then send you out a failure report, which may not be applicable to your building. So it can become quite a minefield once you get one of those notifications from your contractor. My best advice is always go back to them and ask them for the clause of the legislation or the standard that this particular work relates to. Okay, and from my experience, probably about 90% of the time you don't hear anything back, which means you can ignore it. Okay,
right.
I want to see if I'll ask a contractor, you failing this, tell me the clauses that it fails. Okay, and if they can't provide you that, then because then you can check, and then you can go check back on the building, the age of the building, what is required, and is that actually part of the requirements. If it's a defect, proper defect, that needs to be repaired, like a door closer or batteries on a fire panel, there's no questions asked. They need to be repaired and replaced to maintain it. But any other alterations or changes to be made, they need to be substantiated because the systems have been certified at the time of installation.
Yeah.
Okay.
So really, maintenance companies, we should be going back to them a little bit more and asking them, you know, just provide your evidence rather than just provide your quote as well. That's kind of in a nutshell, in a sort of simple way of putting it. Yeah. Okay.
So all our reports that we present to our clients, they don't come back and say, hey, fire matters. They said, this is the legislation, this is the standard, and this is the clause. Mm-hmm. And so there's no questions asked.
Right, so that's a pretty good sign. If the quote comes with all of that additional information, we should feel we can have a lot more confidence that it's genuinely required. And if it's sort of missing some of that information, perhaps that's when the customer has to look at their options or maybe give a little bit of pushback.
And also bear in mind that incentivize their technicians to find work out on site, right? So that's also something to bear in mind, especially when you're choosing a fire contractor.
Mm-hmm. Okay. We're getting a few questions come through in the chat here. One of the key ones that a lot of people are going to ask is how are older buildings considered within these changes? And there's a whole range of issues with older buildings and fire compliance. So perhaps if you'd like to touch on that.
So in regards to the older buildings, they still need to be maintained, but the legislation does not ask them to upgrade any systems to a later standard or later version of the system. So if the building was approved in 1970 and nothing changes in the building, which is the case with a lot of residential buildings, there's really little that needs to be changed on the fire system, or the occupier can be asked to change. It just needs to comply with the requirements of the day of approval.
Okay, so it's really just the year that you were built in is the overriding compliance requirement. What if you lived in an older building and maybe it's built in 1970 and sure your building's compliant, but you're aware that fire regulations and fire controls have improved between 1970 and 1922, and you want to improve, oh sorry, not 1922, 2022, you want to improve the fire safety at your building. What's the best way to go about that? Do you have to kind of leap from 1970 to modern standards? Do you have to change everything all at once, or can you do it in a kind of gradiated way, making small changes to just make things better?
So depending on that, it depends obviously on the equipment type. There's certain equipments, yes, if you do want to change to a different standard or you want to improve to a newer design, it needs to be done in one step. If you have if your building still has the old solid core doors and you think, oh no, we want proper fire doors, well, you can do one every couple of months or 2 a year or whatever your budget allows for the replacement to upgrade those sort of fire doors. Especially in the 70s, there's a lot of old buildings that still have those old doors. In regards to fire detection system, depending on the system, there's systems you can upgrade in stages. Other systems you have to do in one go. It's more on an individual basis, but you have to do your homework, see what your options are.
Yeah. Okay. What difference does a fire door make? If there's a fire and I've got 2 units and one's got a fire door and one doesn't, and it's the same fire in 2 units, what will be the difference in the effect of the 2 units?
So the fire doors are always installed within firewalls, which is a fire make a fire compartment, and they are there to minimize the spread of smoke and flames. So yes, if you having 2 different units opposite each other and there is a fire in one unit, if that fire door is left open, obviously the smoke will travel into the stairwell and or is compromised. The door closer is, which I see a lot, is being taken off by the occupier, or the door doesn't shut properly. Then the fire will not be contained and will put every other resident that maybe live above that fire-affected floor at risk, right? But what you need need to bear in mind is that if you're inside your unit and the fire is outside your unit, well, that fire door is rated, between 30 and 60 minutes, depending on the age of your building. So you'll be perfectly safe inside your unit. You just got to make sure, that no smoke enters your unit, or putting towels down, etc. Call the fire brigade and say, I'm stuck on level 3. I can't get out of my unit. So we've had that scenario at one of the buildings in town, and 3 people got stuck. But what did they do? They didn't react. The smoke alarm was going off. They thought it was a false alarm. So the fire became a bigger fire. And when they decided, or when they figured out there was a real fire, their escape route was compromised. The corridor was smoke locked, so they had to be rescued off the balcony. So your preparation and your action on the activation of a smoke or fire alarm is the difference between waiting at the assembly area for the fire brigade or being rescued by the fire brigade.
Yeah. Okay. So they can really be the critical difference between life and death in the most extreme circumstances.
Well, smoke alarms are designed to detect smoke early, much earlier than you and I can smell it, and or see it. So they're there to give you your maximum available time to escape.
Yeah.
And the moment, and your maximum time of available time to escape starts when an alarm goes off. That's when the time starts.
Okay. And then just touching on smoke alarms there, a lot of people disconnect them. It's the truth, in their kitchen or something like that. They're cooking, we occasionally cause smoke, the alarm goes off, especially if you're in a building that's sort of hardwired to the QFES. You don't want to have the fire brigade come out just because you've burnt your toast or something like that. So it's not unusual for someone to reach up and take out the battery or something like that. What can body corporates do about this kind of situation?
Well, if it is an individual smoke alarm within a single occupancy unit, there's very little you can do because you may not know. You will not know.
Yeah.
But if it's a fire alarm system, somebody will remove a detector. You will get a fault on the fire alarm system, which is usually down in the foyer, and then you'll pinpoint that down pretty quickly to the individual unit in the room. And but yes, we do see, rubber gloves over the smoke alarms and smoke detectors to minimize false alarms. And in the recent years in our builds, or the new builds with the open plan living, they do have increased the unwanted alarms quite significantly. But the fire brigade has been working in Queensland for a long time now with building owners and builders to reduce the unwanted alarms and make the alarms more localized for the individual to
Okay, so
they don't want to come out for a burnt toast either.
No, exactly. Yeah. So, but standalone smoke alarms, it remains quite difficult for us to control their use. But hardwired alarms, obviously, we've got the system and we can monitor much closely. Yeah. So if you're looking at the higher standard, that's the one. Look, here's a question that's kind of a classic question from my time as a body corporate manager. It's from Susie Alexander here. And she says, our building is 4 years old and we've had the same company maintaining our fire safety. Recently, we've been told that the pipework and safety switches in the hydrant pump are defective. They're incorrectly installed, and we now have to rectify at a cost of $4,000. Is it reasonable for the company to have taken 4 years to detect this type of defect?
Again, this comes down to what we talked earlier about, is ask them exactly the clauses that are applicable or that made this incorrect, that made it correct at the time of installation, but now 4 years later made it incorrect, because we have to remember that this building was certified. This installation was certified by somebody that says, I've done everything correctly and here's my signature. So that is the person that is responsible, or the company that is responsible, if they have given you a false certificate. And yes, for them to find that out after 4 years, I have to say it always comes down. It's probably like in any profession, it comes down to the knowledge of the individual, right? If you had 5 minutes in the fire company, or in the fire industry, you only know this much. But if you've got 20 or 30 years, you know a lot more, right? So it comes down to the individual. But in any case, I would ask them, it was compliant on the day of installation, otherwise you wouldn't be in the building, right?
Yeah.
Somebody, building certifier won't issue an occupancy certificate if it's not compliant. So it was compliant on the day of when we moved in. What made it non-compliant? That's the question. Sometimes they're looking at the wrong standard. Sometimes they're looking at the latest standard, not the standard of the day. Sometimes they don't look at the original design. In fairness, not many buildings have got that available, but it should be. It's called, well, you might remember that the baseline data that was introduced in 2005, which basically tells you what the system is designed to and what it must be capable of. That information, unfortunately, is not always on site. So it makes it hard then for the maintaining contractor to confirm and you know, that the system is still there. And if he thinks, oh, this is the wrong standard or this is not correct, it might be of some work or some standard that he's worked with recently. I'm not, like I said, every case is a little different.
Okay, and if we needed them, those kind of original documents, we'd probably go back to council to get them. Would that be the normal pathway? Yeah.
Council or the building certifier. So each building has got a certificate of classification that should be at the entry point of the building, and it tells you the class of the building and the design, or if there's any alternate solution applicable to the building, and it also tells you who the certifier was. So that's the person you would go back to and go, can I please have, you know, the form 16 at the time? In this case, it's a hydrant system. Can I have the form 16 for the hydrant system? Well, that'll be the person that's responsible for putting the switches in the wrong correction, in the wrong destination. So.
Okay, so it's quite interesting. So if something's faulty, it's stopped working. Okay, we can understand that we need to repair it. But if a maintenance company is now saying something is defective for some reason, installed incorrectly, then we should probably be investigating that much more thoroughly to find out why they have that opinion.
Correct.
Yeah.
And correct. And also, yeah, and if it's true, then the responsibility may lie with somebody else.
Okay. Is it easy to transfer that responsibility? I know it's often hard for body corporates to go backwards, especially to go back in time. Yeah.
It would open up the discussion, right? Who put that hydrant system in? Who certified it? And if nothing has changed on the system, then it should still be compliant. So either the maintenance contractor has got it wrong, or the installer has got it wrong. But it's up to those two to decide, and the body corporate to watch.
Okay, good. I've got a question from Cliff here, and he says, we have a townhouse complex of 27 two-story buildings in 4 blocks under a building format plan where each own their own lot separated by firewalls to ceilings. We have only fire hydrants in the center of the complex underground identified by yellow metal covers. What are we now required to do?
So if those hydrants are part of a public road, then there's nothing you need to do. If those hydrants are part of your townhouse estate, then you do need to make sure that they're always accessible and that they're cleaned, and you have to do a hydrant flow test once a year.
Okay.
So the hydrant flow test just confirms that you've got enough water there and enough pressure there for the equipment that the fireys have to operate, because they require certain pressures and flows.
Okay, great, thanks. And I've got a question here from Angus, and he says, regarding class 2s being used as class 3s with no sprinklers in the first 4 floors, built in 2016, how does a fire inspection satisfy compliance requirements? That's quite a difficult question. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah. So yes, we do. Well, if it's built and designed as a class 2, you cannot use it as a class 3 building. That's full stop. So class 3 building has got higher expectations on fire safety systems than a class 2 building. So this would ideally trigger a reclassification of the building, and with that come, you know, upgrades to the building, what's required in a class 3 building. So we've seen this a lot, where the classification of building has changed, or the use of the building has changed from the original classification. And yes, unfortunately, there is only one way to do that: is get it recertified, reclassified.
Okay. Yeah, and there's a sort of follow-up question here, which is, can you use a Class 3 building as a Class 2 building? Is there interchangeability? Not really. Doesn't sound like that should be possible.
It's you're down in a way. You're sort of down changing. Yes, Class 3 is more your hotels, motels, etc. So a higher degree on fire safety. So if you want to use it as a Class 3, Class 2, there's no issue with that at all.
Okay. One of the questions that I had is that most buildings are supposed to conduct fire evacuation testing on an annual basis. And I think you told me before the seminar here that about 80% of buildings don't actually do that. If you could touch on what the requirements there are for doing evacuation testing, what the implications are, because it seems to be just so widely ignored that it's a major problem.
And people always think that, a fire will always happen to someone else, right? And there's not a morning I don't turn on the TV and there's a house or a unit fire somewhere in Australia, right? So yes, if you do ignore, the legislation clearly says you've got to conduct an annual evacuation practice and evacuation planning, no matter what building it is. And if you continually ignore it, well, you're in breach of the legislation. And if nothing ever happens, nothing will ever happen. But the moment it does, and you do not have those documents available, the legislation is pretty clear. It's the occupier / body corporate / managing entity that must facilitate it. It doesn't say you can or you should, you must do it. Right? What's interesting to see with us over the last few years is that the non-compliance rate has actually gone up from 70 to 82%, where people just don't seem to think that there's any value in practicing or doing some kind of emergency planning for the building.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know it's very hard as body corporate managers, because we can say to people you should do it, but somehow it's getting over that cost line can be quite difficult for a lot of people in terms of making that additional commitment to having it done.
So the legislation is actually designed for the occupier or owner-occupier to manage most of it themselves, especially in a small Class 2 building. All it takes is to say, listen, on Saturday morning, we all meet at the letterbox at 9 a.m. and this is what we're going to do if there is a fire, right? It's all on your evacuation diagrams or in the evacuation plan for your building, which you should have. So you go on it, everybody signs it, everybody goes back home. It's done. It doesn't necessarily have to cost anything, right? So if you've got, I know quite a few diligent body corporate chair people that live in their building that manage that quite well, and there's no cost associated with it. Well, but also bear in mind, you do to a certain degree, have the responsibility if you tell people something wrong, right? But it's relatively basic. So yes, no, there doesn't have to be a cost, but if you want to outsource this, obviously there is a cost involved.
Okay, yeah, so committees can organize it themselves and it doesn't have to be that complicated a procedure.
Correct, correct. And this goes up to buildings that up to 30 meters or 25 meters in height, or have more than 30 employees. If we're speaking then it becomes the part of the fire safety advisor for the building, and that it can be managed locally.
Yeah.
All the documentation required is available on the Queensland Fire and Rescue website.
Okay, thanks. And there's a question here from Martin, and he says, why do fire companies charge you to check evacuation plans every year if there have been no changes to the building?
Because it's a money-making scheme. Very simple, right? So AS 3745 is the standard for emergency planning, and in there said that the evacuation diagrams have a validity of 5 years. What it doesn't say is that it needs to be replaced. It says it's still valid, right? So this is an Australian standard, which is it's not actually caught up in Queensland legislation. So in Queensland, the legislation in regards to evacuation diagrams sits in the building fire safety regulations. and the building fire safety regulations require us to review the evacuation diagrams every year. So if nothing has changed for the year, they get a tick. So, but I do know of a lot of fire companies that go out there and they say, oh, your diagrams are 5 years old, you need new ones. There's nothing in the legislation that says you need to replace them if they are still running, right? Another little trick of fire companies is they just go and relocate your fire extinguishers. They say, oh, it's better off on that wall, from that wall, you know, it needs to be there. And you go, yeah, change the fire extinguisher location. And then they come back and say to you, oh, now you have to upgrade all your diagrams.
Yeah.
So, right. And I've been playing that game with a lot of fire contractors for a number of years, where they go around every 6 months or once a year and just relocate a few pieces of equipment and then charge the client $4,000 or $5,000 to upgrade their diagrams. So it's a bit of a easy money.
Yeah, and that makes it really hard for body corporates, because they struggle then to, you know, sort out what the real advice is from the sort of that type of advice, and then people often are resistant to doing the actual beneficial things because they've had that type of bad advice in the past. But perhaps the new legislative requirements will help to some extent control some of those issues. Yeah, and
that's why we're an independent organization that independently looks at it. We don't do any maintenance. We don't do anything. We don't say, you know, this is faulty, here's your quote. We say, yes, we recommend that this is getting done, or, you know, ask further questions, or make sure this will happen. Yeah.
Okay, good. I'm just going to wrap things up here, but as a last question, what you know, we've talked about all the technicalities of fire compliance and everything like that. What about in a real life situation? What's your best advice for anyone out there who is caught in a dangerous situation? What are the top things to, what should we try? What should we, you know, obviously we'll all panic to some extent, but what should we try to keep top of mind?
Yeah, actually, research shows that we actually do not panic in an emergency. We help each other out quite well, depending on, you know, we'll ignore everything. We'll just help any human being. But what my best advice is, if you hear a smoke alarm go off or any kind of alarm, act. Don't ignore it, right? Because it's your available time to escape. I'd rather get up 10 times for false alarms than don't get and it's a fire. Okay, and you know, when you speak to people who've been in a fire situation, what they all say is, what they're amazed with is the speed that the fire develops. So a fire grows in size, doubles in size every 30 seconds. So if you look at it and the fire is this big, 30 seconds later it's that big, right? Yeah. And eventually in an apartment block, right, the hot gases, they can ignite material on the other side of the room. So for your own house and your own unit, have your own evacuation strategy. What do I need to get out of the fire when I need to get out of here? Is your key in the lock, or do you have the key hanging at the door when you have security doors? Where's your, like, you know, research shows we go back for mobile phones, pets, you know, keys, wallet, where we run out of a fire. When we first get the shock, we run out and then we go, oh, I forgot my keys, my wallet, my pet. These are the types of things you need to think about prior to a fire, right? A lot of times also what we recommend to people is have a little grab bag ready, something that, you know, you can grab on your way out, which has got, you know, whatever, bit of money, your medication, you know, set of clothes, whatever it is that you may need. Because if you have a unit fire or a house fire, guess what? You're not going back inside. Yeah. You're not going back in there. So you're in your pajamas out on the front street. So, you know, we had an older lady. She said, "Oh, I listened to you last time when you said that," and she said, "I've got a whole change of clothes and everything in the boot of my car. All I need is my car keys, and I've got some change of clothes, my medication, money, everything in the boot of my car." Yeah. So that's what, especially, you know, every circumstances are different. If you've got kids, you need to practice an evacuation with your kids. If you've got pets, you need to have a plan for, you know, what's going to happen, who's going to get the cat and who's going to get the bird, you know. So that's my advice, is your preparation is the critical bit. And yes, fires don't happen all the time. Well, they do happen all the time, but we always think it happens to someone else.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we do, don't we? It's very hard for us psychologically to imagine us being in a fire, but be prepared and treat it seriously. That's really the key.
You never will. Fingers crossed, you never will.
Yeah. All right. Wonderful. Thanks very much, Stefan. I mean, I learned a lot today. I hope everyone else out there enjoyed the session. Nikki will be back next time, so I'm sure you'll all be relieved about that. Thanks very much for joining us. We'll end the session. Have a good day, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us for this educational session. If you gained value from the information, please like this video. You can also engage further with LookUpStrata by subscribing to our YouTube channel or by being kept informed about Strata news via our regular newsletters. Our subscribe link is listed in the description box below.